So let me just ask you, in terms of these most recent escalations, not just in the war itself between Ukraine and Russia, but also the role the U.S. government is playing in that war, now sending F-16s after we vowed forever not to do that. What do you make of this escalating war and the escalating role of the U.S. in it?
Yeah, I repurposed a line from Fight Club to just say, on a long enough timeline, Zelensky gets whatever he wants. I mean, the F-16 is the perfect example. Just 4 months ago, President Biden ruled this out in an interview with CBS News' David Muir. He said, no, they don't need them. He laid out a major strategic case as to why, the risk of World War III, and he said that privately. But then again and again and again, the Ukrainians, and frankly their media allies, constantly, people like Jim Acosta and others, are airing Ukrainian pilots and Zelensky pleas for F-16s. There's a direct CNN interview that CNN actually deleted. We had to go back and find it, where President Zelensky pleaded with President Biden live on Wolf Blitzer's show from just a few months ago, please send the jets, please send the jets. And increasingly, we are basically being propagandized by our media by not giving anybody the counter case or laying things out in exactly the way that you did, Glenn. I mean, we are being told that this war is about democracy. And now, obviously, that ignores many of the democratic problems that are ongoing in Ukraine and prior to this invasion.
You mean little things like Zelensky banning opposition media outlets even before the war, right, banning churches since the war, banning opposition parties since the war, essentially doing every single thing possible that is anti-democratic in nature? You mean things like that?
Exactly. And none of this is to say, yeah, he deserved to get invaded. It's, should we risk nuclear armed conflict over a scrap of the eastern Donbas region of Ukraine? When you put things that way, or actually not even nuclear war, should we pay more, $3.50 or $4 a gallon in gas? Should we have trillions of dollars that we're spending in terms of our lost economic opportunity, sanctions, the global financial system? All of it was blown up over something which we are told over and over again is so important for democracy. But when you strip away that language that the media is constantly feeding us, then we have a very, very different picture of what's going on here.
So you had a tweet earlier today. You had a couple of them. Let's go to the second one. Where you talked about the kind of financial chicanery taking place, just in terms of the money that is necessarily flowing from the United States coffers into Ukrainian coffers to keep this war being fueled. We're, of course, yet again, by far the biggest spender when it comes to this war. And you said, quote, the Pentagon used an illegal accounting gimmick to circumvent Congress and spend $3 billion more to Ukraine. Now, it seems like every 2 or 3 weeks, Biden stands up and announces another $3 billion here, another $800 million there, another $40 billion here, another $22 billion there. What illegal accounting gimmick are you referencing here?
This is a very important point, Glenn. What the Biden administration has done is they realize we are going to be tapped out of the legally appropriated aid by Congress sometime in October. Ukraine poured tens of billions of U.S. provided ammunition and artillery into the Battle of Bakhmut, which they just lost. This is why when people are discussing, oh, Zelensky is some sort of strategic genius, he is acting as if he has limitless resources. And if you look, I guess, at the behavior of the U.S. Congress, maybe that's why. And this validates exactly what the problem is. We have decided to go back and change the accounting of the way that we have Ukraine's aid. Now, let me explain. Prior to this, the way that we accounted for Ukraine's aid was we made it priced on the replacement cost, as in the replacement cost to the U.S. taxpayer whenever you take weapons that you have in your stockpiles and give them to somebody else. What we've now done, because we realize that there's no way they're going to get by, even on the $100 billion or so that we've already appropriated them, is gone back and backdated and depreciated a portion of the $40 billion of military aid that we have appropriated to Ukraine thus far. Here's the crazy part, though. They have said this is only the first $3 billion or so they've been able to find. There are guarantees that they are very likely to go back and be able to do what they want. This is like what real estate billionaires do on their taxes. They hire depreciation consultants and change something from a 5-year to a 30-year so that they can accelerate depreciation and write off cash losses. All of it is madness because this is an organization which has failed an audit 5 years in a row. that has made no progress, that can account for only 39% of the $3.5 trillion in assets under their management. And they really want us to believe that in this particular case, they are so spot on in their accounting. This is a joke, magic organization whenever it comes to their numbers. And the U.S. taxpayers are the only ones who are really making or are the butt of the joke in this instance, Glenn. And the reason why I called it illegal is because Congress has the power of the purse. Clearly, replacement cost is the way that all aid to foreign countries should be calculated. There's no absolute reason why it shouldn't be that way, since we already do have the intention of replacing it, as was explicitly written in the legislation. We are the ones who are on the losing end here. We've never done this in history. And the biggest problem for this in the long run is this gives the executive even more power on congressionally appropriated aid. How do you and I know that this isn't immediately going to be used for Israel, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, any country, for any president to prop up any conflict that they want? This only makes the imperial presidency even stronger. And it just makes democracy even weaker. The limited democratic checks we had in Congress have only gone down since this time.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons is because Congress actually has given up that authority, in part because they don't want the responsibility for things like war. I remember Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats in 2006 running on a pledge to cut off funding for the war in Iraq, and when they won, they immediately turned around and said, of course we're not going to cut off funding for the war in Iraq, because they wanted to run in 2008 against the war in Iraq, which is what Obama did and won, and yet we were still in Iraq by the end of his first term. And I think it is so interesting because there's almost no more efficient way to make huge amounts of money disappear than to bring together, on the one hand, the Pentagon, and then on the other, Zelensky and the Ukrainians. I mean, there's almost no pairing of a duo that could burn through money with less accountability than that. You might remember Rand Paul stood up at the time that the Democrats unanimously voted with the majority of the Republican caucus to send $40 billion to Ukraine. Rather, all he was trying to do was to attach a few safeguards, oversight, and accounting provisions. Mitch McConnell snidely referred to him as a Kremlin propagandist. That was the end of that, and it not only passed, but passed with no safeguards, which I think gives you a lot of insight into the motive behind the war. And that's what I want to ask you. I think you probably heard Obama was really adamant through his presidency that there's nothing in Ukraine that justifies going to war over it, that makes us consider it a vital interest. Trump said the same. That was why the GOP platform changed, not because Vladimir Putin had sex tapes on Trump, but because Trump consistently had said it's not worth going to war over these places unless we're being directly attacked. So you had this bipartisan consensus, even going back, to like the Clinton and the Bush years, where you would see CIA directors writing memos saying it is an insanity to try and expand NATO up to the Ukrainian border. That is a absolute red line for not just Putin, but everyone in Moscow. And we have no reason why we would do that and risk war with Russia over it. So this is the question. The whole point of figuring out a vital interest in advance is, as Obama said, you need to tell the rest of the world what you're willing to go to war for and what you're not. And our position has always been, Ukraine is something we're willing to write off. That's not in our sphere of influence. We don't care about it. Here we are, depleting our own stockpiles. Literally, we have, oftentimes shortages in weapons for ourselves, $100 million, increasing risks, over doing exactly that, which the bipartisan class in Washington said was insanity for so long to do, which was risk war with Russia over Ukraine. Why do you think this has changed and the bipartisan majorities now in Washington support doing exactly what Biden is doing?
I think, unfortunately, Glenn, Obama was an outlier at the time. He was attacked viciously by the blob. Ben Rhodes and Barack Obama famously actually attacked them in that Atlantic article with Jeffrey Goldberg. Now, he was viciously turned on specifically over that issue with Crimea. Trump, too, we shouldn't forget.
Well, that in Syria, which was the same thing, right? Obama let the CIA go kind of far, but never far enough to really take out Assad. And the foreign policy class hated Obama, John McCain and Lindsey Graham, and that whole crowd, Marco Rubio, but also the hawks in the Democratic Party, over exactly that. Obama's refusal to confront Russia in Syria and Ukraine, and then Trump did the same and got called a Russian agent for it.
Exactly. They never forgave him for not doing a no-fly zone over Syria. Then he applied his same restraint logic whenever it came to Ukraine. On his way out, Trump also is most at odds with the elites in his own party over Russia. It was the one issue where he represented, frankly, a majoritarian view, I'm sure, amongst the GOP base, but not amongst the brainwashed GOP elites. The best thing that ever happened to the GOP elites was the marginalization and the loss of Donald Trump so that they could return to the Russia policy that they previously had long loved. I mean, don't forget, there's that famous Mitt Romney moment in the 2012 debate where he says that actually Russia is our biggest national security threat. Obama actually ridicules him. And of course, that moment was actually celebrated both by Democrats after 2016 and by Republican elites. It was basically a joint agreement. See, Romney was actually right. Russia was our biggest national security threat. And this is where we can't give Trump, too much credit. At the end of the day, he caved and did what Obama refused to do. He sent the Javelin missiles to Ukraine, to this conflict, and pumped even more weapons into it, specifically so he could have some idiot talking point, Glenn, about how, no, actually, he was tough on Russia. And that's how the media and the elites get you, is they say, oh, no, Mr. President, if you want to show the media that you're not soft on Russia, go ahead and send weapons into this morass and it'll make a difference. What happened? Well, we already know it actually precipitated even more conflict and a war. So at every stage, the Washington elites have failed on Ukraine policy. And I would even dispute that, unfortunately, we didn't make clear that Ukraine is not something of a vital strategic interest. We're the ones who basically invited them into NATO in 2008. You can blame our great George W. Bush for that one. And that, Moscow, they have long memories. Putin was literally president at that time. I've heard a famous story that Bush was once lecturing Putin about democracy, and Putin, he actually speaks perfect English, looked him in the eyes and he said, "We don't want the same democracy that you gave to Iraq." And it was one of the big splits in his big splits in their relationship. And it didn't have to be this way. Vladimir Putin is the very first leader to ever speak with President Bush after 9/11. And he said, hey, don't worry about it. Don't worry about our response. You do the response that you need to. He visited the Crawford Ranch November 2001. There was touted as some sort of strong security relationship. Things went off the rails specifically because of the neocons who were in power and because our invasion of Iraq put Gaddafi and Putin and Kim Jong-un. That's actually another great story. North Koreans, every single time we tell them to give up their nuclear weapons, what do they always say? They said, look what you guys did to Gaddafi. You think we're idiots? They're never going away. People outside of the Western bubble, they have much longer memories than the Western press does. And unfortunately, decades of U.S. policy and hubris is exactly the result of what has happened in Ukraine. I love the way that you did your monologue. At the end of the day, that country and its millions of people who are being basically fed into a meat grinder and burned to the ground in some of their cities, they are suffering more than anybody. And anybody who cares about humanity or any of that would want that to stop as soon as humanly possible.
Yeah, I think, this creeping kind of escalation combined with the short-term memories we're conditioned to have as a result of social media, but also just, the passage of time makes people forget. I think we've really lost sight of how insane it is, the idea that we would expand NATO right up to Russia's border. Yes. When, the Soviet Union fell, obviously the greatest threat to Russia in the 20th century was a powerful Germany. They twice invaded Russia. They, in World War II, caused 20 million Russians to die. And both times that invasion happened through Ukraine. That's the most sensitive part of the Russian border. And so when the Soviet Union fell and the United States and the West wanted to reunite Germany, obviously Russia was traumatized by that idea. The idea of this kind of very powerful German state has been almost existentially deadly to Russia. And they said they would accept it. Gorbachev said he would accept it based on the promise that NATO would never extend 1 inch eastward beyond Germany, because now you have East Germany joining the NATO alliance as a result of the unification of Germany. And that was the promise. And now, almost immediately, when Clinton gets into office, they're starting to expand NATO further and further closer to the Russian border. And so the idea of putting Ukraine in NATO There's this sense now that that really wasn't the reason for the war, that Putin doesn't mind having, Victoria Nuland picking the president right on that side of the Russian border, the most sensitive part. That would be so provocative toward anybody, which isn't a way of justifying the Russian invasion. I've long said it's both illegal, it's illegal and immoral to invade another country like that, but there were all kinds of ways to have resolved this war if you wanted to beforehand. Tulsi Gabbard and Tucker Carlson were probably the two most vocal people with the big platform urging that to happen, and they were instantly branded Russian agents. And that shows you how radically this has changed. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.